Fly over Mars. Take a trek through a prehistoric jungle. Tour a house that has not yet been built. It's called virtual reality, and as Jay Shaver found out, all it takes is a special helmet and a glove, and you're off.
So last month, I made a video on the current push for 4K gaming, and in it, I briefly touched on virtual reality. Now, while games will always improve in the graphical department, when there's a push for an entirely different style of play, such as the case of VR, its longevity will always be in question. Is it the next big thing, or is it just a fad? Nintendo experimented, I guess is a nice way to put it, in the virtual reality space with the Virtual Boy, or as I like to refer to it as, here's what games would look like with Terminator vision. That red. It strains my eyes just thinking about it. And one of the things it shared with all of the old incarnations of VR is it failed. People just didn't seem interested in playing games with these obnoxious setups, basically projectors attached to their head. And for the most part, VR was dead for a long time, and then out of nowhere, like a phoenix from the grave, it exploded back into the mainstream. I remember when Oculus first started demoing their VR kits at conventions, and I was shocked to see VR as a thing again, and before you know it, competitors are jumping in it. You've got the Vive, PlayStation VR, the Samsung Gear, which I haven't tried that one, but it's been quite interesting seeing this technology resurrected in such a big way. And it makes sense. As technology progresses, these things become more practical, more powerful. And I think the idea behind VR has always been a great one. I mean, even if you're a hater, take out all the issues the technology had and continues to have, you can't tell me that that core concept, transporting you into the game, isn't at all intriguing. Now myself, I've been very critical of this technology and the push for it. I always am when I feel like things aren't ready for consumption. Again, see my 4K gaming consoles video. For the most part, everything I've played on various VR setups has felt like a tech demo. Extremely simple mechanics. Typically you're in a stationary position, which obviously is going to greatly limit things. And I know that has a lot to do with the motion sickness factor. If you're unaware, motion sickness is one of the huge issues with VR, and tends to be the worst when you're moving. Obviously, you can probably imagine if you're sitting in a chair, but your eyes are telling your brain you're moving, problems can arise. But even with that considered, many games just don't feel like full experiences, whether it be only allowing you to do a couple things or only lasting a few hours. They feel incomplete, and that was one of my biggest criticisms until I played Resident Evil 7 in VR. The entire game is playable in VR, and horror really suits VR well in my opinion. Beyond the fright factor, of course, things are way scarier when you feel like you're actually in the situation. But since the pacing is slower, the motion sickness factor is greatly reduced, and again, this feels like a complete game experience because it is one. Resident Evil 7 has been very well received on its own, sans VR. So no surprise, it's one of the best, in my opinion, the actual best VR experience you can get right now. And sure, Resident Evil 7 stands alone in many of these respects, but my experience with it has given me a lot of hope in the future possibilities of VR, and to get to that point, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. Beyond the two problems I've listed, the lack of quality experiences and motion sickness, I've got three major gripes that would have to be improved before I could really start recommending this to people. The resolution of the headsets I think is still way too low. Tons of jaggies all over the place on every set I've played on, even the PC headsets running on some beefed up hardware. I understand this is a power issue and we need more powerful rigs to provide a better picture, but that's what keeps me from being able to play VR for more than like 30 minutes or so. It just really starts to strain my eyes, because even when they tout like, oh, we're doing high resolution and each eye and all this stuff, it's like you gotta realize you're putting your eyes right up against the screen basically. Beyond that, all the physical elements associated with VR need to be reduced. The headsets, while way smaller, of course, than the OG VR headsets, still feel too big. On top of that, there's wires all over the place. The boxes, you gotta set up all around the room with things like the Vive. It's too much stuff. I want like what the FBI guy from Heavy Rain had, essentially a pair of sunglasses that just transport you into a VR world. I understand, things like that are a long ways off, but all the physical stuff needs to be reduced however possible. And finally, the motion controls. Motion controls are a major aspect that add to that VR immersion, and we've made major strides since, say, the Wii, for sure. But they still feel off in many cases, and specifically in VR, the way something like a gun you're holding jerks around as you move it with motion controls is a huge immersion breaker. I guess tracking is something I'd really focus on with the way the motion stuff works. So yeah, I've got a lot of issues with VR in its current state, but here's the thing. I do think it has a future, albeit a distant future. You see, a lot of the problems with current VR tech are the same problems we had in the early days, but they've all been greatly improved since then. It's just still not perfect, or at least in a state where I think people are going to want to adopt it. And you may notice the price isn't an issue I mentioned. And that's because I think if we can improve these major issues further, people are going to be willing to pay big money for it. And I'm aware plenty of people are paying for it in its current state, and I'm grateful as I get that's what allows developers to improve the technology. But make no mistake, as is, VR is incredibly niche, and it's going to take a lot of time and effort to get it to the point where it can reach a mass market. Essentially, as I've stated in the past, I feel like we're getting deep into the realm of diminishing returns when it comes to improving certain aspects of games, particularly the visuals. We can only refine those edges so much and add physics to each individual blade of grass for so long. And people are getting less and less impressed. VR does feel like it could be where we make the next major stride in gaming. I think there's a huge potential market for people being actually transported into the game, but we've got to work on all these immersion breakers, as that's really the point of VR, right? The true immersion. I could see it being the future, but that future isn't now. And with that, this video is a wrap. Let me know your thoughts on the current state as well as future of VR in the comments, particularly what would get you to invest in VR? What kind of games would you need to see, and how good would the technology have to be? As always, I'm John Zakari, and thanks for watching.
Virtual reality lets you travel to places you've never been, and see things you've never seen, and do things you've never done without ever leaving the room.
Oculus.